Okay, we're going to go into 1 Corinthians chapter 7. And if you remember last week, we looked at Matthew 5 and Matthew 19 as we prepared to go into this chapter. If you want to take a moment just to read a few verses into it, we'll go section by section through it. But if you haven't read it recently, it would help if you just scanned over it. This section is, as far as the letter is concerned, the structure of the letter, this section is where Paul deals with the questions those in the church there had for him. So this is his response to things that they've expressed concern to him about. So he's going to fill them in. It leads us to an interesting question, and people ask it, you hear it all the time. Why did God choose to include only these books in the Bible? Couldn't there have been others added? Wouldn't it have been more helpful if we had more information about other things? And especially as we're going into this particular subject, even with chapter 7 as a source of information for us on how we should live our lives, it still leaves a lot of questions unanswered. So it is an interesting section, just because outside of Matthew 5 and Matthew 19, this is pretty much it for the subject of marriage, divorce, and remarriage. So we're going to learn a little bit more about it. And if you look at verse 1, we see the hint as to the reason for the letter. He says, "Now, for the matters you wrote about." So this is the section that we're in right now. So we're going to go through this till pretty much the end of the book, is what Paul is trying to give back to the Corinthians about their concerns. So here is the first one. So he starts off, he said, "It is good for a man not to marry." So this is Paul's opening statement. If you're making a case for one way or another, this is Paul's opening statement. So we kind of know from the very beginning where Paul stands on this issue. It's better if you do not. It tells us more about Paul himself than actually about us as people. It tells us more about what Paul is able to do, and later he'll talk about what skills or talents or abilities every person has, and this was one of them. To be able to remain unmarried, to remain celibate. Okay, so starting in verse 2, he says, "But," so but is a pretty big change in a grammatical sentence. So even though he says it's better not to get married, but, so here is the but. "Since there is so much immorality, each man should have his own wife, and each woman her own husband. For the husband should fulfill his marital duty to his wife, and likewise the wife to her husband. For the wife's body does not belong to her alone, but also to her husband. In the same way, the husband's body does not belong to him alone, but also to his wife. Do not deprive each other except for mutual consent for a time, so that you may devote yourselves to prayer, then come together again, so that Satan will not tempt you because of your lack of self-control." So he gives us instruction there as to how we should live. If this is something we need to do, then it is something we should do. So even though Paul's stand is don't get married, he's saying if this is something you need to do, then you need to go ahead and be fine with that decision. There's nothing wrong with that decision. Chapter 7 could seem like a contradiction, because if we go to the very beginning, it was God's design to have man and woman together. And Paul even uses that argument. But I think in light of what Paul is saying here, not only for the persecution that was taking place on the church, but also personally, if someone was able to live a life of celibacy, Paul encouraged them to do it. There's a reggae song that has a line in it that plays on these first few verses. And Bob Marley says, "No woman, no cry. No woman, no cry." Only men understand that, right, Kevin? No woman, no cry. His philosophy is, Bob Marley was saying that marriage is not easy. Marriage is not easy. Marriage is very difficult. If you think of our faithfulness to God, how good is your track record? Your faithfulness to God? Doing pretty good? You're 100%? That's good. If you're 100%, that's awesome. Our relationship to God, synonymous with the male and female relationship in marriage. God uses that as an illustration. So we get a sense of what our relationship is like to God when we look at our marriages. When we look at our marriages, we get an idea of what life is like, how difficult life is, how complex life is, how many problems there are. But it solves one huge problem, which Paul talks about here at the end of chapter 5, which is self-control. Paul has amazing self-control. This is one of his abilities, this is one of his strengths. And so he says if you can do that, that's something you should apply yourself to. But if you cannot, then marriage is for you. Then notice in verse 6, this is going to be a play all the way through this chapter. And this is probably where people get caught up the most with chapter 7, is not understanding this next section. So chapter 6, he says, "I say this as a concession, not as a command." Okay, people go to the Bible and they want a law book. They want clear instructions. They want it said plainly, simply, directly, without any complications. They want it just clearly said. Well, if we want things like that, the Bible is a little bit too small a book to handle all of the problems you're going to have in your life. And for God to say it clearly and distinctly on every single subject. The Bible is full of principles, examples, inferences. And these are things that we have to use and try to apply them to our lives. Now, one person may apply them one way, and another person may apply them another way. Some may apply them correctly, some may apply them incorrectly. And this is the trouble. When we get to chapter 7, the biggest problem people have with chapter 7 is they're not sure which way to go. What is Paul really saying? And we've already kind of alluded to one of the issues we have. Should you get married? Shouldn't you get married? I mean, Paul's telling us not to get married. We shouldn't get married. Marriage is bad. Well, that's not what he's saying. So we have to understand what Paul is getting at. So the first hurdle we cross is understanding that Paul is saying if you have the ability to remain single and to work in the church, to work for God, then that's something you should do. But if you cannot, then you need to take the marriage route. But here he is saying in verse 6 that he says this as a concession, not as a command. So he's giving people advice. This is advice. Okay? This is not a command. In other words, he's not saying you should not marry. He's saying it as a concession and not as a command. So there are some things as we go through this you'll see there's this play on what Paul is advising people to do and what people should or shouldn't do. Okay, so in verse 7 he says, I wish. Okay, so he's not saying God says, he says, I wish that all men were as I am. But each man has his own gift from God. So he references the context of the singleness, the idea that it is a gift from God. One has this gift, another has that gift. Okay, so Paul's going to go through this chapter and he's going to give us advice about different things. But there's going to be another aspect here at play, and we'll see it come up in just a moment, which throws us off to some degree. So at this stage, I'm going to ask you the question, what do you understand about 1 Corinthians chapter 7 as it relates to marriage, divorce, and remarriage? What have you heard about 1 Corinthians chapter 7 as it relates to marriage, divorce, and remarriage? Is it talking about marriage, divorce, and remarriage? That's the biggest struggle today. Is chapter 7 talking about marriage, divorce, and remarriage? Yes. Yes, and we'll see he'll kind of lay them out pretty clearly which areas, so we can kind of get an idea that perhaps they asked this one, that one, that one, and he goes through and he kind of methodically answers them. Okay, that's part of it. That's why I think it's really important for us to lay the ground rules down. Some of it is advice, some of it is command. But we're going to see in a moment there's a sort of a parting in the thought of where the command comes from and who's giving the command, and then is one command the same as the other? And we're going to see that in just a moment. So my contention is that it is speaking about marriage, divorce, and remarriage. Because the real question I have is, if it's not speaking about marriage, divorce, and remarriage, what is it talking about? I used to joke about marriage today. Marriage in the 21st century, I call it extreme dating. You get the joke? Extreme dating. Because it didn't last very long. Marriages don't last very long. Just married for a little while, find somebody else. Marry them for a little while, find somebody else. You know, if you're going to do that, that's a whole legal issue you don't want to get into. Just don't do that. But that's the way we do things today. Well, I think they had a similar problem, because this is Paul, a Jew, protected by the law, in a society where marriage was a little bit more sacred perhaps than the average Gentile, and yet he's writing here to a Gentile audience. So they obviously have a lot of problems, and we can see by these issues, these areas within marriage, divorce, and remarriage, that they had a lot of problems. So let's look at the first one. In verse 8 he says, "Now to the unmarried and the widows." So this is his first section. So the Corinthians must have said, what about the unmarried and widows? What about them? How do we decide what to do with these people? What should they do? And if you notice, he says, I say, it is good for them to stay unmarried, obviously, because that's Paul's thesis statement in the whole chapter, as I am. But if they cannot control themselves, they should marry, for it is better to marry than to burn with passion. So Paul sees it as a practical response. It's practical, makes sense. But he says, I say. But notice the next section in verse 10, he says, to the married. So before we have the unmarried and the widows, and now we have the married. He says, to the married, I give this command. So he doesn't say, I say. He says, I give this command. And if you notice, it says, not I, but the Lord. What does he mean there? I think this is where we have the parting of the ways. Okay, this one comes from the Lord, and that's why we read Matthew chapter 5 and Matthew chapter 19. So what we have to do here is we have to understand that Paul is now drawing from Matthew chapter 5 and Matthew chapter 19 to give us this instruction. So he's saying, I command. Well, it's not really mine, he's saying. Jesus gave this command, but I'm going to tell you, this is what you need to do. So he says, a wife must not separate from her husband, but if she does, she must remain unmarried, or else be reconciled to her husband, and a husband must not divorce his wife. Okay, so we get the first hint here of kind of how the chapter is going to go. Okay, because he says, notice the phrase, a wife must not separate from her husband. But if she does, she must remain unmarried. So what does separate mean? Leave? Is it just leave? What does the next section say about husbands? A husband must not divorce his wife. Okay, so separate and divorce, Paul is saying here, are basically the same thing. One is just a legal term, one is just a practical reality. Couldn't. That's why. Yeah, that's why. Okay, today it's possible, isn't it? I don't know much about divorce, and especially not the rules in Texas. But a woman can divorce a man in Texas. Am I correct? Okay. Okay. Someone said I know? Oh. Well, different culture. Yeah. That's where we are. Paul. Yeah. Yeah. And I think that's why it's important for us to realize that this is a chapter about marriage and divorce, because if we use only the old law, it is the old law. Okay, it's not the new covenant. So even though some of those things are valid, just like marriage is, it's not something that's invalid. Marriage should be something that continues. God could have said, you know what, we're not doing marriage anymore, we're doing away with that. But that's not how He set society up from the very beginning. Okay, we've alluded to that before. So we have to try to figure out, what is the church now going to use as instruction? What is the church going to teach about marriage and divorce? Because it can't really go and use the Old Testament. Okay? And I think not only that, God was looking way into the future and He knew things were going to change. Okay, that's why in this section right here we get the idea of what's really taking place. You see, here a woman can only separate from her husband. In other words, let's say he's beating her up, okay? And she realizes, if I stay here longer, he may kill me. So she packs all this stuff up and she takes off. Pew! Practically, she's divorced him. Because if that was the other way around, and she was beating him up, he would just write her a certificate and send her away, because she's crazy. Yeah, but now it's the other way around. Well, she can't do that. Not under Jewish law. Okay, but Paul is basically saying, practically it's the same thing. Okay, that's what we have to understand that. So as we go through the chapter, we're going to see this idea of divorce, and we're going to see this idea of separation. And they are the same thing. Okay? And there are some practical things associated to that, and we'll get to that in just a moment. Okay, so it's very difficult for even in Roman times, the Greco-Roman philosophy of life, men were in charge, women were not, but they had a little bit more freedom in the pagan world. But here he's using the command that Jesus gave, and the command that Jesus gave is from the Old Testament. And that's why chapter 5 and Matthew and chapter 19 are important, because Jesus explains what that means. Why is marriage a good thing? Okay, there is the sin component, and I think that's probably the most important component, because that's how God wanted it from the beginning. Okay, now we're going to get to the next component. You said? Okay, practical component. There's a practical component. Okay, so there is the sin aspect of it, because God has designed us a certain way. Okay, now, if you violate any law, what happens to you? You're punished. Okay, there's a consequence, right? Okay, so if you have sexual relationships outside of marriage, there are consequences to that. Okay, the first one is sin, obviously. So God's not going to get you right away. You're going to live a long life doing all kinds of crazy things, but at the end, you're going to pay for that. However, you touched on the practical thing. There's also a practical aspect to marriage as well. Okay, if you are not married and you conduct sexual relations with everybody around you, what happens? There's a punishment, right? There's a consequence. This is where our world has difficulty understanding the sexual relationship that God has designed. When you do those kind of things, you're violating natural law, laws that God has set up. Not just spiritual laws, but you're violating natural laws. When you violate natural laws, there are also consequences. Okay? If I were to take out my pistol, put it to my head, and pull the trigger, what would happen? I wouldn't do it again. That stops me from doing it. I only do it once. That's a bad consequence, yes. But that's a consequence, isn't it? I violated a natural law. An object moving at 900 feet per second hits my skull. It's going to go through it. If it hits the brain, I'm dead. Can't do that. Okay? So we have this spiritual component to marriage, and we also have this physical component to marriage. Okay, if you remember last week we read out of Deuteronomy chapter 24, and I want to read the last line in that section. If you remember, it talked about this concept of putting a woman away. Jesus refers to it in Matthew 5 and 19. But there's an interesting line at the very end. And if you want to discuss it, we can. Otherwise, I'll just leave it for you and you can bother you for the rest of your life. But here it is. At the end of that section, in I think it's verse 4, it looks like, God says, "Do not bring sin upon the land the Lord your God is giving you as an inheritance." In other places, it'll talk about bringing a curse upon the land. Okay, we run around out there willy-nilly, just doing whatever we want. Bad things are going to happen. And they're not just physical things, they're also spiritual things. Which are kind of coming back a little bit, but they're still not the majority. If we would teach those, and we would teach them about marriage the way God intended it, and when you honor your spouse and you're living that life the way you're supposed to live, then we wouldn't have these crises that we're seeing now. We see so many people unhappy, so many people divorced, so many people living from marriage to marriage to marriage. When we take it back to that, that point in time where we deviated from the biblical concept or from God's teaching the way that He intended for us to live. Okay. Let's give up right here. I can't take it. But going on what you said, what else does that produce? If we start killing our future, what are we going to do to you who are older, all you gray hairs in here that take up space and breathe my air, eat my food? Isn't that what's happening too? In some states it's legal for you to just decide to end your life. Suicide is a sin. It used to be a crime. It doesn't make any practical sense either. It is hard, yes. Yeah, they arrest your body and they detain you a little longer. You can't get to the ground. But if you think about it, if you start, what stops somebody from, if we're killing babies, because they're unwanted, to killing people who are disabled or bedridden or basically drawing off the system later on in life. And that's what we're seeing today. There is a complete devaluing of human life. We can't do that. Those are some of the consequences that we're facing today. And if we look at the progression, as Elizabeth has said, I mean, it just one follows out. It's domino effect. And that's why it's really important for us to preserve what God has preserved as important, and realize that marriage is what holds a culture together. It's what holds a nation together. It's also what holds the church together. You know, if you go by even Paul's example, if all of us remained unmarried, this is the last generation. The experiment's over. Everybody dies and Jesus comes back. There's no future. We've got no future. So there are some practical things that we have to consider, but there are also these spiritual components. Now the reason why I said we should consider that last verse, chapter 24 in Deuteronomy and verse 4, is because I believe there are other consequences to basically self-destruction. And sometimes we can't always put a finger on it. We can't always figure these things out. And if we ever wonder why that happened, maybe that's one of the consequences of this violation right here. Maybe that's the result of it. Maybe we can't always put our finger on it. Maybe we can't always prove it. But God knows better than we do, and yet, people just do what they want. Then they sit there and go, how did this happen to me? Well, it's because of some of those practical consequences, not just the spiritual ones. It's the practical ones as well. So God has designed life to be a certain way, and then, of course, man comes along and disrupts it. There's also a practical aspect in marriage, as we talked about in chapter 10, in the sense that if somebody leaves, it is the same as a divorce. Because if we go back to even the very beginning, as Paul says in the first few verses, if there is no sexual relationship, if there is no connection between the married parties, there is no marriage. Even the law says that, right? You can't marry someone for any other reason than being married. You can't use that as some way of getting around the system. Okay, it's very common today here for people to marry illegals. And then after a few years they get a divorce and that person's now legal and everybody goes on. Well, the government's going to come after you. So there are some practical things that we cannot do to circumvent the system. Okay, just like not being married and trying to live as if we are married, there are some practical problems with that. If you're living with somebody and they die, and they owned everything, it goes to their nearest relative, you lose it all. Now, of course, unless there's all these other laws that prevent that. But there are these practical things that take place outside of marriage that are a problem as well. We have to deal with those as well. So somebody leaving, okay, they're telling the other person, we're done, I'm out of here. They're gone. Okay, now there's always, as Paul said, there's always this hope that you can be reunited. That's why he says there, if she does separate from her husband, she must remain unmarried. Okay, so the goal is to get back. But if that person does not, if that person takes off and starts a relationship with somebody else, it's over. Okay, a lot of times in the church you've heard the argument about, I'm going to say it, the guilty and the innocent party. Anybody have heard that argument? When there's a divorce, to try to explain this particular chapter, Some have come up with a phrase which you don't find anywhere, not even in legal terms: the guilty and the innocent party. Now remember, marriage is not something where there's two separate lives, correct? After a while, our lives become intertwined in many ways. How do you cut through the boundary of the marriage? You can't. So is there ever a guilty and an innocent party? There might be a very rare case. But in all the failures that I've seen, there's never been. I've never seen a purely innocent party and a purely guilty party. I've never seen one. You may have, but I have never seen one. To some degree, we are responsible for each other, aren't we? I met a man once who, I think he was in probably his late 30s by the time I met him. He had 3 children. I think the one was maybe just entering the teen years. The other 2 were preteens. One was a little bit closer to teenage years. And I asked him where his wife was, and he said he didn't have a wife. And I asked him what the circumstances were, and he said that he came home and she was gone. She just took off, packed her stuff and left while he was at work. And so I started asking a little bit about their relationship, as we talked, and it seemed like everything was great. And you'd say, hey, but isn't that an example of an innocent party? Isn't he the perfect example of an innocent party? It would seem so, right? Not if you asked him. If you asked him, there was something he did. There was something he said that made her mind up to leave. Perfect, but not perfect. I don't think marriage is that simple. I don't think marriage can be clearly separated that easily. I think by this chapter we can see that. When a preacher looks for a job, that's one of the questions the elders ask. You know that? That's one of the questions they ask. I don't know if they did here. Maybe. I can't remember. All runs together. What do you believe about marriage, divorce, and remarriage? You know what my answer is? It's very simple. Just as Jesus said, when you decide to live your life with somebody, that's it. And then man gets involved. Boy, and we can mess it up, can't we? The law is simple, but life is certainly much more complicated. Okay, so in verse 12 he goes into the next section where he says, to the rest. And notice the phrase there, he says, I say this, I, not the Lord. Okay, so if we use what was said earlier in verse 10, I give this command, not I, but the Lord, he is saying this is what Jesus spoke about in Matthew chapter 5, Matthew chapter 19. Of course, they didn't call it Matthew chapter 5 or Matthew chapter 19. They just talked about what Jesus had said about marriage, divorce, and remarriage. Well, here is what Paul says to the rest of those who are kind of lumped into this group. Now, I don't know what the rest is. Can you think of what the rest is? To me, the most disturbing things in the Bible are things that are hinted at but are not defined. Who are the rest? Okay, you've got widows, you've got people who never got married, you've got people who are married. Who are the rest? Ever thought about that? Maybe we shouldn't spend too much time thinking about it. I don't know. Who are the rest? Okay, if you are in any other situation other than that, unmarried, widowed, or married, if you're in any other situation, this applies to you. Okay, that could be a lot of things. But notice he does say this is his instruction. This is not Jesus' instruction because Jesus never covered this subject. Why didn't Jesus cover this subject? Okay, the church hadn't been established. That's pretty obvious. That's practically what's happened. But there's also something else. We hinted at it in verse 10 and 11. Based on that, based on the fact that the church hadn't started, how do you give instruction when there's really no law regarding it? And then, how do you give instruction when you aren't talking to just one culture? You're not talking just to Jews, right? If the church was established, it was established on many nations. So you got all different kinds of people coming into this thing. Okay, you know what one of the biggest problems in Africa is with marriage, divorce, and remarriage? It'll surprise you. There we are, that phone is going. Oh. You know, I thought God didn't talk to us, but He probably does. Okay, so think about the fact that we got all these different nations coming in. You think about, for example, Africa as a whole in general. They do one thing in Africa very different to, say, Europe or Asia. Anyone know what it is? Usually the men have more than one wife. Okay, talk about a difficult situation. So the guy comes to the church, and this happens many times. God comes into the church, we teach him, we baptize him. When he comes up out the water, he says, yeah, these are my wives right here. Then you're going, oh, now we've got a problem. Now we've got a problem. How do we deal with this? Anybody want to give advice? See, Paul is giving advice right here, isn't he? He says, to the rest. To the rest. But even in this section, we won't find polygamy mentioned. Gets a little tricky. So, marriage is not an easy subject, just dealing with all these different cultures coming in. So here he includes this all in the rest, trying to make sense of what man has really messed up in a royal way. Okay, we've really made a good mess of marriage. Not that in other cultures those kind of things don't work because they have their own set of rules, but those are not God's rules. Okay, so in verse 12 he says, if any brother has a wife who is not a believer and she is willing to live with him, he must not divorce her. And if a woman has a husband who is not a believer and he is willing to live with her, she must not divorce him. For the unbelieving husband has been sanctified through his wife, and the unbelieving wife has been sanctified through her believing husband. Otherwise your children would be unclean, but as it is, they are holy. But if the unbeliever leaves, let him do so. A believing man or woman is not bound in such circumstances, as God has called us to live in peace. How do you know, wife, whether you will save your husband? Or how do you know, husband, whether you will save your wife? Okay, so is this divorce? Has to be. That's the whole subject of the chapter. Otherwise he wouldn't say to the rest. This is my instruction on marriage. So this is an instruction on marriage. And he is saying that if somebody wants to leave, let him go. They're not saved anyway. And that's why he says, how do you know if you would have saved them? You don't have control over that. You don't have control over what someone's going to do. We can try to make people do things, but we don't have control of determining their eternal destiny. They have to decide that for themselves.
So what does it mean, like, with the verse when it says they'll be sanctified by their spouse?
Yeah, that's a troubling one, and also the children are also considered legitimate or illegitimate. I think it's just a matter of being right with God or being wrong with God as far as the relationship's concerned. Because that person still, as he says, that person, you can remain married to that person and they could still be spiritually lost. But the marriage, there's nothing wrong with the marriage. A marriage is legal, it's scriptural, it's spiritual, it's legitimate. So that's what he's saying. If you stay with this person, it doesn't negate the marriage. Okay, take it from, so marriage is a contract. Legally speaking, it's a contract. It would be the same if we as Christians made a contract with somebody, say we were buying a house from somebody, and we were Christians and they were not. Do we honor the contract or not? Or do we say, hey, I'm governed by God's laws, this is my house, I'm not going to pay you anymore? We can't do that, right? So this is what it's saying here, is that if the relationship, if someone in a marriage, husband or wife gets baptized and they become a believer and the other person is not, that marriage is still a marriage. You'll notice later in this section he speaks pretty clearly about when the way you come to the Lord is the way you should remain. Don't change your lot. Okay? So if you were married outside of the church, that marriage is still a marriage. Just because you become a Christian, it doesn't wash away that marriage. That's what he's saying here. So if you become a Christian and your spouse does not, and then they want to stay with you, that's a marriage. That's a legal marriage, a scriptural marriage. Not only that, he's saying it's a spiritual marriage. It's fine. You have made the marriage, because you're a Christian, you have made the marriage more secure. You've not made the marriage less secure. That's what he's saying. And the same with your children. Your children are not illegitimate children. Okay, there's a spiritual aspect, as we always talked about, there's a practical aspect. Okay? If you're a husband or a wife and you die, all of your belongings get passed on to your surviving spouse. And if your surviving spouse dies, all of your belongings get usually passed on to your children, right? That's what the Jews are most concerned about, is what they'd worked for, what was theirs, God had given them, would they be able to pass it on to their spouse and then pass it on to their children? Yes. He is saying yes, they can do that. Now I don't know about Jewish law if that was possible. If a non-Jew married a Jew and the Jew passed away, would the state of Israel respect the fact that all of that property had gone to that alien? I would suspect not. But here Paul is saying that's not the case. That marriage is legitimate because you're a Christian, and even if they're not, that's how it should be. So both the non-Christian spouse and the children, for that matter, are made legitimate by that marriage. I think Paul is trying to say that we can't just get out of something just because our life has changed. We do that a lot, right? That's our rationale. You hear new converts saying that all the time. Okay? That's one of the reasons why they do crazy things, because they say, I'm a Christian now. All the responsibility of the past is the past. My life has changed. Paul is saying it's not so. All the contracts you have made still stand. In fact, they stand even stronger now because you know better. Okay, so all the responsibility you had before still stands. Okay, I'm going to leave you with a thought as we close the class. So, a black man in Africa comes to the church and he's baptized, and he tells the elders of the church he has 3 wives. What must he do?